yurttaşlarım, az zamanda çok ve büyük işler yaptık. Bu işlerin en büyük temeli Türk kahramanlığı ve yüksek Türk kültürü olan Türkiye Cumhuriyeti'dir. Geçen zamana nispetle daha çok çalışacağız. Daha az zamanda daha büyük işler başaracağız. Bunda da muvaffak olacağımıza şüphem yoktur. Çünkü Türk milletinin karakteri yüksektir. Türk milleti çalışkandır. Türk milleti zekidir.
Kingdoms will fall, empires will rise. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, a small Turkic-speaking tribe called Ashina in faraway Asia established the first transcontinental and multi-ethnic steppe empire in history. These so-called Gökturks, meaning the Celestial Turks, climbed the political ladder of the Asian power struggle and became a mighty faction of steppe warriors just north of China. The Ashina then united all Turkic peoples on the continent, with its influence reaching from Mongolia to Eastern Europe. The Gökturks became the superpower of their times. Welcome to the rise of the Gökturks.
In Season 1, we established that the Gökturks were the first Turkic empire to officially bear the name Turk, and that they ruled over the first transcontinental steppe empire in history, one that was even larger than that of the ancient Huns or of the Xianbei Confederation. But unlike typical nomadic peoples before them, the Gökturks empire actually featured extensive state-like bureaucracy and a sophisticated administration. The Gökturks did not wander around the plain steppe in their lust for war and violence, but instead ruled many different peoples under the banner of the Ashina family. The Ashina basically controlled a massive army and was supported by mighty noblemen. This type of realm is known as a Khaganate. The Khagan, or emperor, had absolute power in the state. As was usual in Europe, the Middle East and East Asia, the Khagan did not rule directly over all regions of his empire, but instead appointed vassals and governors to keep the realm of the Gökturks together. Gökturk can be translated to blue Turks, with the color blue designating the east as well as the sky, which is why that name can also be translated to Celestial Turks. For all we know currently, the Gökturks did not refer to themselves as Gökturks, but simply as the Turk people. Göktürk is a term used by historians worldwide to differentiate them from any other Turkic peoples before and after the days of the Khaganate. In any case, the Khaganate was built on a firm foundation, and although the Turks suffered a painful defeat in the Turco-Persian War in Iran, as we have seen in the last episode, just after having conquered northern Afghanistan, they were by the end of the 6th century able to maintain their geopolitical position in Western Asia. Even after their losses against the Sassanid Empire, the power projection of the Gökturks was not to be underestimated. The Turks controlled most of the Silk Road, from the Khaganate's border at the Chinese Wall all the way to the trading hubs of Bukhara and Samarkand in Uzbekistan. Thus, the leverage of the Turks was comparable to that of the Persians and Byzantines, empires that also had an interest in controlling trade along the many routes of the Silk Road. Nonetheless, in practice, the Khaganate was officially not one coherent empire, as it had been divided into two parts shortly after the death of Bumin, its founder and first Khagan, just 1 year after the creation of the Khaganate. Istemi, being the younger brother of Bumin, had taken control over the Western Khaganate and was quite successful in expanding the Ashina dynasty's realm to Europe and the Middle East. Istemi's journey to the west, his achievements and the deeds of his successors are already known to us. But as the younger brother of Bumin, he was not the Khagan of the empire, only the Yapgu, which corresponds to the European title of king. And although the Yapgu acted independently in foreign affairs, he was formally subordinate to the Khagan, the real emperor of the Khaganate, who ruled over the eastern part of the empire, which in turn included the legendary forest capital of the Khaganate, Ötüken. But what actually happened in this region of the empire after Mukhan, Bumin's eldest son and Istemi's nephew, took over the throne of the Khaganate. The death of the founder of the state, Bumin, who had also been the head of the ruling dynasty of the Ashina, probably hit the nobility of the Göktürk Empire unexpectedly. The reason for his death has not been clarified to this day. There are not even rumors, as in the case of Attila the Hun, of an assassination attempt or illness. In any case, his brother Istemi now faced a huge problem. A state with its leader dying shortly after its establishment might fall into a deep crisis and split again within a brief period of time. To prevent this, the empire was formally divided into two parts. While Istemi held the office of Yapgu, king or rather viceroy, he left the throne of Kagan, that is the highest office of the Khaganate, to Keluo, probably the eldest son of Bumin. Keluo is the Sinicized name for Kara, so his real name probably was Ashina Kara. As a Kagan, Kara adopted the name Isik and led a final campaign against Deng Zhu, the leader of the remnants of the Rouran Khaganate. Deng Zhu had fled to the Northern Qi Empire after the suicide of his father, Anagui, who had been crushed by Bumin in 551. The local Chinese emperor, Wen Shuhan, himself descendant from the Turco-Mongolian Xianbei and actually named Honigan, took Deng Zhu and his family into custody. However, after the defeat of one of his sons by the Mongolic Khitan in February of 553, Deng Zhu was forced by Wen Shuan to go to battle against the Göktürks by himself. Presumably, the Northern Qi, who shared a border of about 1,500 kilometers with the Göktürks, were afraid of a Turkic campaign into their territory, but Isik beat them to it. As late as 553, Deng Zhu marched to prevent the Göktürks from ruling his father's former territory. Isik Kagan was able to overcome Deng Zhu's army though. After his defeat in southern Mongolia, Deng Zhu was assassinated by Afuti, one of his advisors. Afuti in turn now backed Kangdi, another son of Deng Zhu, and helped him ascend to the Rouran throne. But after Kangdi was also defeated by Isik's troops in a second battle, Anlu Chen, the last son of Anagui, took over the position of leader of the Rouran on the instructions of Emperor Wen Shuan. Anlu Chen and his family were settled by Wen Shuan near Mayi in present-day Shuzhou. Basically, the emperor had hoped that he could persuade the Rouran to attack the Turks once again, but Anlu Chen rebelled against the rule of the Northern Qi in 554. When the remnants of the once noble Yuezhi dynasty of the Rouran now went to war with their former supporters of the Northern Qi, the outcome regarding the rule in the region had been decided. The Göktürks, under the banner of Isik Kagan, had finally defeated the Rouran, secured their borders with the northern Chinese states, and thus prevented a return of the former feudal lords or a split of their newly founded empire. Just as Bumin had once rebelled against Anagui and driven him to suicide, Isik also managed to defeat Anagui's son, Deng Zhu, and thus drive his family to commit political suicide. In the meantime, Istemi had already been adventuring in what is present-day Kazakhstan with his 1,000-man-strong army, helping his dynasty expand its influence beyond Mongolia. In 555, the empire of the Göktürks was already twice as large as the legendary steppe empire of the Hunnic Xiongnu. Now of all times, Isik Kagan died. As with his father, the reason for his death was unclear. Fortunately, a state crisis was averted when Mukan, or Muhan in Turkish, the next eldest son of Bumin, ascended the throne with the support of the Turkish nobility and stabilized the political situation in 553 or 554. From that point on, the political system of the Göktürk Khaganate remained remarkably robust. While in the west, Istemi Yapgu ruled until 576 and consolidated the power of the Göktürks in Western Central Asia, while crushing the Hephthalites and thereby coming into contact with the Sassanid and Byzantine empires, Mukan Kagan ruled in the east under ideal conditions until 572. As we have seen, the Göktürks had to deal with remnants of the Rouran Khaganate in the years 552 to 554. That is why they reached their territorial limits to the south of Öteken, On the other side of the Chinese Wall were two significant Chinese empires. In the southwest, the Turks bordered the Western Wei. The emperor of this domain was called Fei and ruled an area that stretched from the oasis city of Dunhuang in the west to Tongwang in the east. The river Amur, which the Chinese called Heilongjiang, served as a natural border to the other Chinese empire in this area, the Northern Qi. The Qi ruled from the river Amur in the west to the coast of the mainland in the east. But in between the Chinese and Turkic states, the last people of the Rouran were still roaming the steppe, trying to find both refuge in China and take revenge on the Gökturks for the rebellion of Bumin and his Ashina clan. To contact with one of these empires, the Western Wei. When he had still been under the vassalization of the Rouran, the young Turkic prince had established relations between his own Ashina dynasty and that of the Western Wei, called Turba. After Bumin's victory over the Tile, he had asked his lord Anagui to have his daughter as a bride in return. We already know that Anagui refused and called Bumin a low-tier blacksmith slave, and such, perhaps unintentionally, started the rebellion of the Turkic peoples under the leadership of Bumin in 546. But there is more to the story. The reason why Bumin and his family confidently revolted against the mighty Rouran lies in the relations with the Western Wei. Just after Anagui's insult, Bumin had received an envoy by the Turba clan. The leader of the Western Wei was at the time Emperor Yuan Baoju. Emperor Baoju had forced his own crown prince Qin to marry a princess of Anagui a few years prior. But after seeing the rise of the Gökturks as an opportunity, he put his alliance with the Rouran at risk and sent one of his own daughters to Bumin's headquarters. Thus, the Turks established an alliance with the Western Wei. While it is unclear whether they were actually aided by the Turba in their struggle against the Rouran, we can say for sure that the political balance of power had after this event shifted from the Rouran to the Gökturks by help of the Western Wei. The Northern Qi did not actually help the Gökturks, nor did they see Bumin's rise to power as a positive event for their own sake. Apart from being excluded from the power politics in the region, the Qi had indeed felt threatened by the Turks and therefore accepted the remnants of the Rouran into their territory. At the same time, Emperor Wen Xuan started to build a 500-kilometer-long wall from Shaanxi to the Shanhai Pass, near the eastern Gökturk Qi border. When Mukhan succeeded Isrik as Khagan, he continued to fight off the remnants of the Rouran until 555, when the last Rouran ruler in history, Teng Shutse, had tried to find refuge in Western Wei territory. But the new Wei Emperor Gong, being aware of the strategic importance of his alliance with the Gökturks, handed the Rouran out and forced him to leave northwards. Another small Rouran ruler, called Tiefa, had simultaneously been killed by the Khitans east of the Gökturks' realm. Thus, the Rouran, once and for all, had been no more, and the Gökturks now directly bordered both the Western Wei and the Northern Qi. Of significance to us are the connections between the Gökturks and the Western Wei, as an important example for the thesis that there had been no continuous barrier between the sedentary Chinese and the semi-nomadic Turkic and Mongolic people. Then again, neither the Western Wei nor the Northern Qi were actually Chinese. The leaders of these empires were both descendants of the aforementioned Turba clan, and in conclusion, the sons and grandsons of steppe peoples. Prior to the foundation of the Gökturk Khaganate, China had been splintered into many parts. The legendary Han dynasty had once united all these peoples that lived within the Chinese cultural sphere into one large empire that stretched from the eastern coast of the Asian continent to the Turfan Basin. Even parts of Mongolia had come under control of the Han, but at the same time, one Mao Tun, known in Turkic as Teoman and in Chinese as Tumen, had united all steppe peoples in Mongolia under his banner. Teoman or Tumen had created the first steppe empire in history, around 700 years prior to the Gökturks. They were known as Xiongnu in China, but they might have been the ancestors of the Huns of Attila. After a lot of back and forth between these so-called Huns and the Han dynasty, both empires crumbled. While the Xianbei took the place of the Huns and established a loose confederation of steppe peoples without including the descendants of the Huns, China was also cut into many parts. During the 2nd and 3rd century, the so-called Three Kingdoms ruled most of China, being in a warring state against each other. Legendary figures such as Cao Cao have gotten famous thanks to the epic Romance of the Three Kingdoms that was published centuries later. However, at the same time, the steppe peoples also went through anarchic times. The Xianbei leadership did not manage to unite all tribes as once Tumen had done, and thus lost control over their own territory. Slowly but steadily, many tribes or clans left Mongolia and went southward, beyond the Chinese wall, to establish their own dynasties and states, and thus their own identities. Two such states were the Western Wei and Northern Qi. As careful as the Gökturks had been in the struggle for domination over Northeast Asia, Mukhan did not hesitate to use violence whenever necessary. After becoming Khagan in 554, he started various campaigns both within his own empire as well as beyond the realm of the Gökturks. Mukhan is an interesting case. Little is known about the third Khagan. For all of his might and glory, he was not even mentioned in any of the Turkic inscriptions from the time of Ashina rule, while his father and uncle, the brothers Bumin and Istemi, are even praised by the Uyghur Khaganate in inscriptions during the rule of Bayanchuk Khan in 765. The Ashina brothers were admired by the same Uyghurs who had actually betrayed and destroyed the Gökturk Empire just a few years prior, thereby taking their position as hegemons in Northeast Asia. Mukhan was described by Chinese historians as a man with strange looks. In the Book of Zhou and in the history of the Northern dynasties, Mukhan is being described as having a white face, which would be seen as typical for steppe peoples, but also as having reddish hair and eyes of lapis blue color. This speaks volumes about the heterogeneity of the Gökturk people. Nonetheless, that shouldn't distract us from the fact that Mukhan was not only a mighty, but also diligent and vigorous ruler. After finishing off the Ru run, he turned his attention to the west and north of the Khaganate. While Istemi had already arrived near Bukhara in 555, thus securing the Silk Road from Mongolia to the Caspian Sea, Mukhan needed to take care of some Avar tribes who were still roaming the Eurasian steppes and were on the run after the Ru run's downfall. In addition, Mukhan conducted several military operations against the stubborn Kyrgyz people near the Yenisei River and thus achieved control over the northern periphery of the Khaganate. By subduing the Kyrgyz and making them his subjects, Mukhan also secured the gold and iron mines of the Yenisei that were under control of and being exploited by the Kyrgyz. According to Chinese chronicles, the Kyrgyz did so with gritted teeth. Rebellious tribes from the Tile Federation, which we have discussed in episode 3, were also successfully suppressed. Lastly, the Khagan attacked and conquered the territory of the Mongolic Khitan people east of the Khaganate in 560, in the process establishing Gökturk rule to the border of the legendary Korean kingdom of Goguryeo. This marked the beginning of the Turkic-Korean Brotherhood, which we will discuss in the next episode. But danger was already looming on the horizon. The Northern Qi mobilized against a war with the Gökturks, albeit never managed to seriously attack them. Meanwhile, the Western Wei Empire collapsed after a high-ranking general called Yu Wentai overthrew the emperor and proclaimed a new dynasty, thereby taking the title of Emperor Wen. Wen reaffirmed his alliance with the Gökturks and thus strengthened his position against the Northern Qi. This new empire was inspired by the legendary Chinese Zhou dynasty and was from then on called Northern Zhou. However, Chinese affairs became complicated in the 570s when the Sui dynasty was established. The Sui subdued all other dynasties and unified all of China for the first time since the days of the Han dynasty. And unlike the Western Wei, Northern Zhou and Northern Qi, the Sui were both able and willing to attack and diminish the power of the Gökturks. But unbeknownst to the Turkic people, the Chinese would not simply draw on military might and ruthless aggression, but instead use tactics of deceit and conspiracy in their struggle against the steppe people. The Sui carried the battlefield deep into the realm of the Khaganate and placed their sleeper cells where they would hurt the Turks the most, inside the Ashina dynasty.
Az zamanda çok ve büyük işler yaptık. Bu işlerin en büyük temeli Türk kahramanlığı ve yüksek Türk kültürü olan Türkiye Cumhuriyeti'dir. Geçen zamana nispetle daha çok çalışacağız. Daha az zamanda daha büyük işler başaracağız. Bunda da muvaffak olacağımıza şüphem yoktur. Çünkü Türk milletinin karakteri yüksektir.